Hi, Darren.
Hello, Bob.
How you doing?
Very well, thank you.
Good. Let me introduce us. I'm Robert Wright. This is The Wright Show. You are Darren Beattie, and you are here because you are that very rare species, someone in academia who openly supports Donald Trump. And that's what we're going to talk about. Before we get into that, I want to ask you about your current status. Now, when you first came to my attention, you were a visiting professor in the political science department at Duke, and you had written a letter to what I guess is the Duke student newspaper about defending Trump's travel ban, and, at one point kind of asking how healthy it was that at an institution like Duke, you were the only faculty member who had openly supported Trump. Now, I know this was in March. I know you're no longer at Duke. Is that just because your pre-agreed tenure as visiting professor had ended, or is this related to your being the lone supporter of Trump?
No, actually, I'm a recovering academic at this point, pursuing projects outside of academia, but I don't want this to deter any academic watching this who would assume that this is on the basis of my Trump support. Academia was actually very welcoming to me, and I had further opportunities if I wanted them. I just, for other reasons that we might discuss in a separate podcast, I opted to leave the academy. But I can't claim any special kind of victim status on that.
That's too bad. That's too bad. That would be good. That would be good for you if you could. So I would like to distinguish between two things in the course of this conversation. One is supporting Trumpism, and the other is supporting Trump. In other words, one is supporting the ideology he was kind of taken to represent during the election, leaving aside for a moment the question of how thoroughly he has actually turned out to represent it. But in any event, I want to separate all that from the question of Trump the person. I mean, I'll be honest, it's a lot easier for me to understand supporting Trumpism in some broad sense of the word than supporting this person as the standard bearer. But we'll get into that. Why don't we start off by asking, how would you describe your own ideology? I would guess, based on what relatively little I know, that you're like a Buchananite conservative, or not.
No, I wouldn't describe myself as really a Buchananite or a conservative for that matter. I think one area that we were discussing earlier that engages a lot of my academic interest is the obsolescence of traditional political categories that I think are very much connected with a particular Cold War circumstance that no longer exists. So I think we're in a very disruptive period politically, where traditional classifications really obscure more than they illuminate, and really I think it's a period that demands fundamental reevaluation of basic premises on both sides. And I suppose if I could, in a very summary fashion, recapitulate the basis of my support for Trumpism, the Trump phenomenon, is that this, more than anything, has catalyzed precisely the kind of rethinking that I think is so necessary in our politics.
Well, you could say somewhat the same thing about Bernie Sanders, right? I mean, he was calling into question some traditional Democratic dogma, and both of them were somewhat economic nationalists. So, I mean, I guess the question I'm getting at is, like, if you're not conservative, why Trump? I mean, but maybe we should put that off and let you elaborate a little more on the kind of reconfiguration of politics that you see. Because in my mind, it's kind of up for grabs right now which party is going to make a serious play, for example, for the white working class, right? It could kind of go either way in theory, but in any event, why don't you talk a little more about what you see ahead in the way of party realignment and what the causes of the coming realignment are?
Yeah. So just to take things, one issue at a time, I think this issue of conservatism is actually a very good opportunity to talk about two different, I think, basic camps. There's some overlap, and I share some opinions with the other camp, but I think it's useful to distinguish two basic camps of Trump supporters. There's one camp to which I belong. I was not simply a Trump supporter once he won the nomination. I was a Trump supporter since July of 2015.
Whoa.
And so I think there's actually a very different outlook when you distinguish between those who are very early adopters, so to speak, and those who kind of came on the bandwagon after the primary. And I suppose, and I would, I have tremendous respect for Professor Bauerlein, who you had on your show earlier, and I watched your conversation with him with great interest. But I think that
we should say he is a Trump supporter too, from a somewhat different ideological perspective than yours. He's kind of a religious conservative.
Right. I wanted to bring this up is to say that I think that there's a group of Trump supporters, usually who came on later, who interpret Trump essentially as within the parameters, to the extent that they can, of the movement conservatism of the Reagan period. And so they like Trump, as I do, for that matter, on the judiciary. They like Trump on a lot of things that overlap with the agenda of, any other kind of conservative. And they liked him because he was not Hillary Clinton. So in the light of that general election contest, and I really agree with a lot of what they have to say, but I think there's a different base of support that comes from those who don't interpret Trumpism as a kind of restoration back to these ideal principles of Reaganism, but involve, to some degree, a fundamental reevaluation of those principles themselves in light of contemporary circumstances. Mm-hmm. And while there's a lot of overlap between the two, I would say I lean toward the latter camp.
Well, and could we say one more thing? I mean, is it the case that, on balance, the parts of Trump that appeal to movement conservatives were some of the later additions to his own ideology? In other words, he's not traditionally been known, I think, 2-3 years ago as like a social conservative who cared about abortion, right, or any of this stuff. He's not a very religious person. Mm-hmm. So is it the case that actually, whereas he has been, look, he hasn't, sketched out a super coherent ideology for decades or anything like that, but I think people can find traces of economic nationalism and things he says going back much farther than 2 or 3 years.
For the 80s, really.
And some skepticism about an interventionist foreign policy, a skepticism he seems to be in the process of abandoning, but we'll get to that later. Whereas with this, the movement conservative, the religious conservative appeal seems to me a relatively late addition. Is that related to what separates you from some of these other supporters?
Well, to some degree. I have no antipathy at all toward religious conservatives or their issues. I would say that, yes, certainly one wouldn't, the culture wars, say, of the Buchananites or the Santorums and these types, that certainly was not a prominent feature of what Trumpism was about, although he made a very, I think, interesting and instructive piece with that group. And I would describe that, of course, as with any insight, there's a lot of qualification to be made, but I think his attack on the culture of political correctness, combined in a very interesting way with his maybe substantive flexibility with respect to the social issues. And in other words, it was almost an inverse approach, whereas Trump was willing to fight, go to bat, attack the institutional culture that was very hostile to the interests of movement conservatives without really embracing their substantive issues in the way they're used to. Whereas I would say, somewhat in a critical fashion, the movement conservatives were used to paying lip service substantively to all their social conservative issues, but they simply were not willing to fight for them at all in any meaningful way. And so he kind of flipped that in a way that I think was tremendously effective and astute politically.
So some of his appeal has involved convincing conservatives that he hates the same people they hate, in a certain sense, to oversimplify it, and you might quibble about the word hate, but it seems to me that that's actually a lot of his appeal, and that's why he can actually get away with a lot of stuff without his approval rating dropping below 40% at this point.
Well, yes. I mean, I don't know if I would use the term hate, but within the broader cultural and political context, the fault lines that are emerging are fairly clear, that Trump is very much on the side of movement conservatives and religious conservatives, certainly as opposed to any other kind of viable alternative.
Mm-hmm. So, okay, I want to get back to elaborating on your analysis of the realignment going on. But first, just one quick question. You said initially, I think, that you wouldn't characterize yourself as conservative, but now you say you're not antagonistic to these various things that characterize the conservative movement, religious conservatives. Well, if you're not, I mean, what is it that makes you not a conservative? What do you believe? What are the things that make you not a conservative?
Well, I think that conservative is it's an obsolete term. I'm certainly not a member of, I suppose in order to understand what conservatives would mean in this context, you would have to understand what paradigm are you operating against. And I think the prevailing paradigm now that I'm opposed to, or at least critical of, is not one that fits into conservative on one side, liberal on the other. Mm-hmm. For instance, just to give you an example, on trade, economic nationalism, and so forth, that was an issue, as you point out correctly, was common to both Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump. Mm-hmm. In fact, I encourage your listeners who haven't already, go look at an interview with Ezra Klein of Vox. Ezra Klein's talking with Bernie Sanders. Sanders sounds very Trump-like on immigration, in fact, saying that he prefers an immigration policy that prioritizes the interests of the American working poor over the global poor. Very kind of nationalist type position. And so I think in order to correctly categorize political affiliations, one has to take into account what transformation on the left, for instance, the left's abandonment of economic issues for identity issues, and how that reorientation toward identity politics has proven in a very uncanny and counterintuitive way incredibly compatible with the new type of capitalist structures that have emerged since the Cold War. And so this means there's a whole host of things that are not traditionally conservative that I would question in economic policy, in terms of debt relief for young people. It's just once you understand the obsolescence of these categories, the kind of thinking that becomes required is one that I think really doesn't lend itself to that.
Okay, so if you think conservative's no longer a useful label, then I would rephrase the question and say, why did you support Trump and not Bernie Sanders? Is it because Bernie Sanders, although he himself showed a little bit of resistance to traditional identity politics, was in the end willing to accept identity politics as part of the Democratic Party's identity?
Right.
So
I mean, one of principal reasons I supported Trump was his position on immigration, which...
Well, yeah, but as you just said, Sanders himself had some skepticism about immigration. I'm saying in light of that, why Trump and not Sanders?
In the beginning, he did, but he made his appropriate concessions to the reality of modern-day democratic politics and became...
Meaning identity politics.
More aggressively in support of open borders immigration policies. But beyond anything substantive about him, he just wasn't a fighter. I mean, and this actually came out in some of the...
Bernie Sanders, really?
No, he wasn't a serious fighter, and he wasn't willing to do what it takes to win, whereas Trump was. And I think that he was really something that his role was to lose and essentially provide some kind of inspiration to the Democratic base that wanted to latch on to populist issues.
So it's not a deeply ideological difference that led you to support Trump rather than Sanders.
Well, first of all, Bernie Sanders didn't articulate any kind of foreign policy, really. Can you really state what his foreign policy was? And that, I think, was very interesting, given what a golden opportunity that was for him to have attacked his primary challenger, Hillary, for her foreign policy. The fact that he didn't do that, the fact that he didn't go after the email.
He did a little. I mean, hadn't he actually opposed the Iraq War in the Senate, and didn't he make something of that?
But he didn't make that an issue.
Unlike Donald Trump, I might say. Unlike Donald Trump, he actually opposed it clearly in advance of the war.
Okay, that's irrelevant to the dynamic of the campaign. My point is that there are many people on the left to whom that would be a very effective political strategy for Bernie Sanders to hammer Hillary Clinton on her foreign policy, which he did not.
Yeah.
And so that is one of many instances that collectively indicate to me that he was not a fighter. He was not willing to.
Well, foreign policy is not his biggest issue. That's true.
No.
And at the risk of getting ahead of ourselves, I just have to ask you quickly. So Trump professed to be a non-interventionist and so on. Are you not a little disappointed with the rate, the speed at which he seems to be being co-opted by the neoconservative Republican establishment in foreign policy?
That's a very complicated question. My position on foreign policy issues, more having a conversation publicly that more accurately reflects the actual situation with respect to, say, Syria and Russia and so forth. And
yeah, but he's backed off of all that. He's bought into like a Middle Eastern war between these Sunnis that he thinks are the good guys, although now apparently he's decided that Qatar is not part of the good guys. But even leaving that aside, and that late-breaking development is, I think, alarming to anyone who cares about peace, the role he's played just over the last day or so. But he's bought into this narrative of Iran is evil, and that very much cuts against what you're saying, a kind of a realism about what we can do about Syria. Because if Iran is evil, then it's going to be a lot harder to do business with the Russians over Syria. So he seems to have abandoned that, maybe partly under the political pressure created by the questions about Russia's role in the election. But for whatever reason, I'd be kind of shocked if you told me you're still optimistic about that part of his foreign policy.
Well, let me try to clarify. It might take a few minutes. I think the fundamental problem about our discourse with respect to the Middle East situation, Russia, and so forth, is that we face two somewhat competing objectives. Geopolitically, Iran is an enemy. Geopolitically, there are problems with Assad's Syria. However, the geopolitical interests we have in perhaps attenuating the regional power of those actors runs at odds to some degree with our interests in combating terrorism, specifically ISIS. And I think that the discourse on politics, certainly domestically in the United States, has not been able to accurately reflect that nuanced reality. And I'll give you one example of that. During the primaries, you had essentially everybody, except for Trump. You had Rubio, Jeb, Hillary Clinton, and so forth, calling for a no-fly zone in Syria. Now, I would imagine that the average American who is watching this would interpret it as to say, no-fly zone is tougher than what we have now. Syria is where ISIS is, and so what they're calling for is a stronger posture against ISIS, who's been attacking everyone, as I've seen in the news. Of course, the reality is that ISIS does not have any planes. These planes were Russian planes, and so what that amounts to is escalating a potential conflict with Russia. Now, maybe that was a good idea, maybe not. The problem, in my mind, is that the discourse does not accurately reflect these realities between geopolitical threats that may be posed by Russia, Iran, and Syria, and so forth, and the problem of terrorism. And in light of our less than optimal outcome in Iraq, in Libya, and so forth, I was very disappointed by the lack of really a kind of discourse on foreign policy that took earnestly the lessons of those antecedents. Yeah. And so just really quickly, I just say I'm not an interventionist per se. I simply want the goals and the likelihood of achieving these goals to be more accurately thought through and clarified to the general public.
Yeah, I'm all for clarity, and you don't have to convince me that our foreign policy discourse lacks nuance, or that it fails to appreciate how unstinting opposition to Russia and Iran complicates the war against ISIS. I actually disagree with you, I think, on the extent to which some grave geopolitical threat to us is posed by Iran. I think that's actually hugely exaggerated by the standard, foreign policy, institutionally supported discourse. But we don't need to argue about that. My main question was, aren't you disappointed in the turn that Trump's foreign policy is taking? Hasn't he abandoned that kind of realism? I mean, just in the in like accepting the Saudi narrative, about what the issue is. I mean, they seem to have convinced him that the source of that some kind of Qatar-Iran alliance are supporting ISIS. Now, maybe today's ISIS attack on Iran will stimulate some actual cerebral activity in Trump's brain. I wouldn't bet on it. But at last check, he had bought into this Saudi narrative and seemed oblivious to the role that Saudi money has played in fomenting, the kind of ideology that often morphs into terrorism, which isn't the same as directly supporting terrorism. In any event, aren't you disappointed? I mean, come on.
I think it would be premature to really express disappointment on that. I think you raise a very interesting point about realism. Now, the realism with which I'm familiar draws upon a certain critique of what they consider sort of an interventionist, neoconservative policy that is really animated by a kind of utopian, aggressive moralism. And so the realism is meant to stand in opposition to a kind of moralism. To some degree, I'm sympathetic with that critique, although I find it very interesting. By the way, I'm no fan of Saudi Arabia, and I've actually called in my Duke piece that you mentioned to add Saudi Arabia to the travel ban list. I'm not pro-Saudi, and I'm certainly not pro-Qatari, which as a nation state donated millions to Hillary Clinton's campaign. But that's incidental. The point, losing my train of thought here.
Well, you were talking about neoconservative idealism. I'd actually question that formulation. But anyway, versus the kind of realism you support.
Right. On realism, if realism is meant to stand in opposition to a kind of more aggressive moralism that might not take the interests of Americans first as a matter of foreign policy, then it's very interesting because one can at the same time acknowledge the supreme immorality of a regime like Saudi Arabia. But if one wants to take a realist posture, that doesn't solve the case. The question is our relative support for Saudi Arabia as opposed to Iran, given the contemporary geopolitical situation, in the best interests of the United States? That may be true, maybe not, but that is the context of the debate that would have to occur within a realist framework. And a lot of people with whom I'm in great sympathy who take extreme issue with our relationship with Saudi Arabia are actually doing so from moral terms. They're horrible record on human rights and so forth. And yet it's interesting that these same people critique the moralism of a neoconservative foreign policy. This is just one example of how the whole issue is not really clear in people's minds, and these old categories simply are not suited to working a foreign policy that serves the interests of Americans and America first. That hasn't been worked out yet to any degree of satisfaction.
Okay, so I promised to get back to your views on this, just this shifting landscape of American politics. So you start out in the Cold War, a particular kind of conservatism had emerged. I think sometimes the term used is fusionism or something, right? Where you wound up getting an alliance with, I forget it's like a three-legged stool or something, right? It's like religious conservatism, Cold War hawkism, and economic, if not libertarianism, a certain laissez-faire attitude. Right. Are those the three legs that we had that were the Republican Party?
Well, broadly speaking, yes. These are the three legs of the Reagan coalition, which is sort of the paradigmatic expression of what's sometimes called movement conservatism, a kind of social conservatism animated by, say, the religious right, a kind of libertarian free market type thinking that was really built up by people like Hayek, Milton Friedman, and so forth, but also figures like Frank Meyer at National Review. And then there is a kind of aggressive foreign policy posture that was really filled by these so-called Cold War hawks. And these three pieces fit together. And people have caught on to this. I mean, there's a great piece by George Nash on this. There's a piece by a fellow called Gladden Papin in American Affairs on this, and very insightful. I would add that there's certain features of the ideological structure of classical Marxism that actually lend a kind of false coherence to the way that the movement conservatives coalition was put together. Now, to just state it very briefly, if any of your listeners know a little bit about classical Marxism, they'll know that it very essentially integrates a doctrine of dialectical materialism with a kind of atheism within a single philosophical doctrine, a coherent philosophical doctrine. Mm-hmm. And this was a doctrine which, by the way, was taken up as the ideology of our leading competitors post-World War II. That, I think, more natural fusionism led to the possibility of a kind of reactive fusionism whereby the religious conservatives and the free market libertarians, who have a lot of disagreements among themselves, it's easier for them to come together and within the context of a competing ideology, which is both atheist, a communistic, so opposed to free market ideals, and adopted as the leading ideology of our chief foreign competitor, which could bring in the aggressive, the foreign policy hawks. With the fall of the Soviet Union and this new paradigm that has emerged, which is an interesting kind of reconciliation with a extremely destructive left-wing identity politics that has merged into the structure of many of our expressions of contemporary capitalism.
Now wait. Pause on that note. I mean, I get the first part. So during the Cold War, kind of capitalists who were opposed to communism for obvious reasons convinced highly religious Americans that communism was also a threat because it was atheist, and that all amounted to a cohesive support for a hawkish Cold War policy. Right. But now you're saying after the Cold War, after the logic of that falls apart, that what is the new connection between identity politics and what, capitalism or free market economics?
Right. I mean, what's emerged, and this has happened really concurrently as part of the same story as effectively the left wing abandoning its core orientation that was rooted in a kind of softened classical Marxist idea, at least in the sense that it prioritized economic concerns of a working class, labor unions, and so forth, that abandoning that in favor of an identity politics was very favorable towards certain organs of our new sort of post 1970s globalized capitalist type economy. And as just a symbolic instance of this, I encourage your readers to look at an average Google Doodle or look at the extent to which these mega corporations have embraced at least the aesthetics of this identity politics, but more substantively...
Meaning they're pro-diversity, a lot of Google Doodles?
Exactly. Pro-diversity, the whole identity politics agenda, which encompasses a certain attitude toward also involves gender relations, gay rights, and so forth. In fact, another piece that I would encourage your listeners to look at is a very interesting piece by Glenn Greenwald, no right-winger, who wrote the picture was worth even more than his very insightful words. And the picture was the GCHQ, which is the British equivalent of the NSA, illuminated with the gay rainbow flag. And he said this is very troubling, the extent to which these left-wing identity causes have merged within the structure of these institutions that traditionally the left was willing to critique. And so I think this is a problem both for the left and for the right.
Okay.
It's a problem for the left because the left, as a psychological need, needs to understand itself as competing against powerful structures. They're speaking truth to power. On the right doesn't like the idea that the identity politics that they disagree with has a curious and inconvenient compatibility with the mega corporate structures that they tend to support. And so this new paradigm of this merger between certain expression of post-war capitalism, globalized capitalism, and the most insidious elements of left-wing identity politics, this new reality as the reigning paradigm is simply something that is not convenient to either side invested in these obsolete political categories.
Okay, so to let's maybe take those in turn, the left and the right. So the left, I mean, one way you can imagine this this identity politics kind of helping to sustain a not so far left set of economic policies is the following, and I discussed this a little with a guy named Freddie DeBoer not long ago on Blogging Heads, and it's that as a practical matter, if the Democratic Party can hang on to the black and Latino constituencies, that alone gives it a lot of leeway in terms of how much, if it can retain their allegiance on grounds of identity politics as opposed to economic policies, that gives it a fair amount of leeway in terms of how much it actually has to propose economic policies that serve the needs of low-income people, right? So it can sustain a donor base. It can hang on to Wall Street as a donor base and get the black and Latino votes by appealing to just identity issues as opposed to really economic issues per se. And what you wind up getting is it's really not paying much attention one way or another to the white working class, but it manages to cobble together a majority coalition. Is that part of what you're talking about?
Well, I certainly think that's, I'm talking about more sort of the ideological, historical origin of this transformation and significance. But I think as an electoral strategy, the left was at least premature in its assumption that it could conveniently ignore the white working class vote. I think that's a big part of this election. And in fact, Bill Clinton, the politically astute man that he was, apparently warned Hillary's people that this was the case, and they dismissed his attitudes as the antiquated perspective of an old white man, much to their later chagrin.
Right. But I guess I'm asking, what is, in your view, kind of the organic connection that within the Democratic Party as it stood during this last election, binds the identity politics to the not all that left-wing economics?
Well, I think it's in some ways it seems completely counterintuitive and fragile, which it is. But there is a certain logic to that combination. I think that logic really has to be understood within the broader frame of the political alliance between the highest elements of the elite and the underclass against sort of the middle class. And this is a domestic alliance that in macrocosm is interesting to consider, because even though the middle class and the working class of Western developed nations have suffered as a result of globalization, actually the global middle class has benefited tremendously. So it's sort of another version of what's happening, is that you have a really alliance in economic terms, and of course is also as a matter of kind of political patronage between the most powerful elements of the elite and these institutions, and what perhaps would have been called a kind of broad underclass. And these two groups are actuated against the interests of the working or middle classes in the Western developed world. And I think this is a view that complicates the traditional, maybe the haves and have-nots. Mm-hmm. It's more of a tripartite structure whereby the ones who have the very most and those who have the very least have found a kind of commonality of convenience that could sustain temporarily a political alliance against the lower middle class working people of the Western world more broadly.
So in this scenario, the support of like the Black and Latino parts of the coalition are not being sustained merely by the rhetorical appeal to identity politics, to affirmative action, to enforcement of the speech code, and so on. Yeah. There also are the welfare economics of Medicaid and food stamps and so on. Is that what you're saying? That we do actually provide some economic benefits? I mean, you kept using the term underclass, which I assume you see as overlapping with the Black and Latino parts of the coalition. That's what I'm inferring. And so I assume you're saying there actually are economic benefits being extended to those groups by the Democratic Party. It's just that Medicaid and food stamps don't help the kind of lower middle class, the working middle class.
Right, and let me just add that it's a convenient fiction of the rhetoric of this Democratic coalition that there's some kind of people of color that reflects a commonality of interests of everyone who isn't white, and the whites are, the boogeyman in this case. And that I think immigration is an interesting issue that brings us up, whereby you have large-scale immigration into Western countries, into the United States from the developing world. And here the alliance between the elite and the underclass is very clear, and that is in order to exploit the cheap labor, which actually has a tremendously disproportionate negative impact on all low-skilled workers in the developed world, including many African Americans. And so I think for historical reasons, I'm not that optimistic that African Americans will in any significant way move the other side, but I think that there is some underlying tension there that the Democratic operatives go to great lengths to suppress.
Okay. So I gather, I think I can discern several sources of your support for Trumpism. One is a kind of skepticism about the benefits of free trade as it's been practiced, at least. I know you've got a piece that hasn't been published in National Review Online as we speak, but you said has been accepted for publication, which you elaborate on your argument for kind of economic nationalism.
Right.
There's that. You are also concerned about the role that immigration, low-wage immigration, plays in imperiling the jobs of relatively uneducated Americans.
Mm-hmm.
And then I gather you support the travel ban. That's a different kind of skepticism about immigration. That's on grounds of security. You're concerned that an influx from Muslim nations would increase the chances of terrorism.
Well, look, I lived in Germany for 2 years while I was writing my dissertation, and I was a first-hand witness to the before and after of Merkel's policy, and I can tell you that the travel ban is a very advisable policy stance.
Okay, so are those the main three things? It seems like there was a fourth one that was on the tip of my tongue. But does that capture? Your anti-identity politics I gather in part because of the way this is facilitated what you see as a kind of almost a corruption of the Democratic Party from your point of view. Oddly, I mean, you just don't like the role identity politics has played in kind of confusing the whole debate.
Right. I mean, you bring an interesting issue, and then I want to follow up with actually the chief psychological reason behind my support for Trump, which you haven't covered. But I wanted to just introduce a counterfactual. Suppose that Trump had lost to Hillary Clinton. What would be the implications of that for our politics? The left would have doubled down on its most vulgar kind of corporatist interventionist expression embodied by the Clinton family. And the right would have said, see, we ran someone who appealed to the interests of the working class and he lost, and so next time we really need to push someone like Jeb Bush. What would have happened as a counterfactual if Trump had lost was would served as a kind of hyper-prophylactic precisely to the kind of fundamental rethinking that I think is so important. And so let me get to the psychological reason behind my support. I cannot claim to be such a charitable person that my chief animation is the concern for the working class, the working poor. I do have concern for them, but I would say my chief animation is my contempt for our so-called elite in the Western world.
Technically, in the sociologist sense of the term, you are an elite, but so this can't be a completely sweeping indictment.
I would consider myself elite, but I would consider those for whom I have contempt merely as insiders, not an elite. But I have the same kind of contempt for them that they have for the white working class. And let me give you an example, actually. Not only was I was actually the only non-tenured full-time faculty in the country to publicly support Trump's candidacy. But I was the only faculty member at Duke to correctly predict the outcome of the election. I think those two are very much related. And in fact, to the extent that I did receive a bit of negative blowback for my position on these things, people were really more frustrated by the fact that I, as someone who is a political theorist, as opposed to the methodological political scientists who use sort of third-grade mathematics to predict things, always unsuccessfully, those the reason that they were upset is the kind of ironic fact that I, as the theorist in the department, was the only one who made the accurate prediction. And I just think that for so many reasons that would probably require an independent discussion on its own, our elite is, I can't even do them the justice of saying they're degenerate. I mean, Alcibiades, of whom I'm a big fan, is degenerate. Our elite is simply infected to the core with a kind of lazy mediocrity that I simply can't stand, and I don't think they deserve the gratification of the contempt that they wallow in for their supposed inferiors.
Yeah, I don't want to get off on this. I think, the idea that the cosmopolitan elite has contempt for middle Americans, ordinary Americans, I'm skeptical of that, I think it's overstated, partly because I think it almost gives them too much credit to think they spend much time thinking about these people one way or the other. But I also whenever a huge amount of energy, in this case conservative energy and money, has been spent for decades propelling that meme. I mean, this goes back to Dan Quayle saying, cultural elites are the enemies. I mean, a huge amount of energy has gone to selling that message. Mm-hmm. Whenever a huge amount of energy has gone to selling a message, I'm skeptical of the message. I think it's been overstated. But that said, I don't deny that as a practical matter, centrist and, elites have, broadly speaking, ignored an emerging problem kind of in Middle America. Which is the situation with, relatively uneducated workers, the white working class, and a lot of things. So I don't.
Right. I mean, I guess I think that the so-called elite or who run their dominant institutions have this really frustrating combination of moral cowardice, hypocrisy, and intellectual mediocrity. And I actually was in a debate with a colleague at Duke on the travel ban, and I stipulated qualification to my support for it. And I would say I would support the influx of refugees according to the State Department's objectives, so long as the refugees were distributed in Georgetown, in Bethesda, Maryland, within the confines of these gated communities, from the safety of which our mediocre elite wallows in their self-righteousness. But instead, coincidentally enough, the refugees tend to be concentrated in an area with meatpacking industries. So, I mean, that's just to give you a flavor of where I'm coming from there.
Yeah. Okay. As far as the travel ban goes, let's do. We don't have much time left, but I promised to get to the distinction between Trumpism and Trump,
right,
the candidate. And I said it's easier for me to understand supporting most aspects of Trumpism than Trump, the candidate. And let me just start by asking you: did you support the travel ban in the rhetorical form it originally assumed, which is ban all Muslims?
Well, I wouldn't say all. I think that should be an acceptable feature of our discourse, or at least I think that we should question why it's completely acceptable within the approved political discourse to advocate for bombing the hell out of some Muslim majority country, but it's all of a sudden beyond the pale simply to restrict travel.
Well, no, I think you're conflating two things. I'm not talking about immigration, banning immigration, even strict listing a bunch of Muslim majority countries and banning immigration, which is what Trump wound up doing. I'm talking about the original thing he said, which aroused concern and opposition from a number of people, including me, which is just ban all Muslims for the time being. Ban an entire religious group, an entire, in effect, ethnic group. Did that bother you?
Well, it's not an ethnic group, but
as sociologists do include religious groups as ethnic groups, but we don't need to quibble about that.
That's strange.
It's not a racial group, but
right. That's a strange definition. But in any case, I would simply say it's probably unnecessarily inflammatory, because at the time that he said that, the actual stated immigration policy on his website, which was fantastic, called for a 20-year moratorium on immigration to the United States completely, which, as any student of logic would know, would encompass...
Well, okay, fine, but leave that aside. Come on. Yeah. My question is, do you support a ban on Muslims?
No, I only by virtue...
Or oppose it?
Only by virtue of the logical extension of my support for a 20-year complete moratorium on immigration in any appreciable scale.
Okay, so you don't support a ban on a religious group, immigration by religion. Okay, so that's the answer to my question. But you do think specifying a number of Muslim-majority nations is okay?
Of course, yeah.
Okay, but what about the incoherence of it? I mean, the idea of including Iran and not Saudi Arabia when I don't know that there's ever been an act of terrorism on American soil by an Iranian American in the name of Islam or Islamism or anything else. Whereas Saudi Arabia, the role of some Saudis, in 9/11 is well known. What about the manifest incoherence of the selection of nations?
Well, I mean, it depends on your definition of incoherence. I mean, as a matter of domestic threat of terror, I don't think there's been a singular instance of a Shia, let alone an Iranian doing it.
Precisely.
But that doesn't mean that they are not a geopolitical adversary. And so I don't necessarily have a problem with including Iran. As I stated, I suggested in my piece that I would support it, including Saudi Arabia on that basis. But again, there's maybe a cost-benefit analysis to say, and whether we like it or not, we are very integrated with them on a number of levels that would make that difficult. My only view is, would the ban, as stated, be an improvement from what we have now? And I'd say that is a resounding yes. So you're saying, could it be made better? Yes, but is it better?
Well, isn't there something deeply suspect about the whole thing, is what I mean?
No.
I mean, I don't understand what you're saying about if Iran is a geopolitical threat. Again, I think that's greatly exaggerated. And I think, ironically, here you're buying into exactly the establishment, institutional discourse that is funded by a lot of money from a lot of sources that in other realms you're skeptical of. I mean, I think you're
well, I'm not dogmatic. I'm simply stating a fact.
Okay, but that aside, I mean, well, I don't know. No, it's not a fact. I mean, it's an opinion. But even if I grant you the opinion, if Iran is some kind of geopolitical threat as a nation state in the region, and yet we've never seen any proclivity for actual individual Iranians to come to the U.S. and commit terrorist acts, why would you? Well, you seem to suggest that Iran's status as what you consider to be a geopolitical rival or something justifies their inclusion in the travel ban. I still don't get that part.
Well, it certainly does. I certainly don't think the Iranians or any people, for that matter, have any kind of entitlement to come into the country. And because my ultimate objective is precisely the 20-year immigration moratorium, the more countries added to that list, the better from my perspective.
Well, okay. Again, if you're going to say, well, all nations should be included, yeah, but that's not what Trump did. I mean,
okay, but again, 6 is better than none, and I think given the 6 that we identified are especially problematic nations.
Okay, I thought you'd been arguing that Iran was actually had a particular logic behind its selection, but I take it that you're just saying the more nations, the better.
I do think there's a logic. It's what they call it leverage. It's a certain leverage with the Iranian regime. They're not geopolitically friends of ours, and so I don't really see that much lost in including them. That wouldn't be necessarily my top priority, but I'm not getting hung up on it precisely, especially because my ultimate goal would be to include basically every country as a de facto moratorium on immigration for 20 years. I don't think we need it.
Yeah, I guess the subtext of my question is, and you don't have to answer this because we've kind of talked about it, but aren't you kind of disappointed in the actual direction Trump has headed in? Because here, with Iran, by including Iran, he's just serving like a center to right of center establishment consensus that I thought was what he stood in distinction from, the traditional foreign policy consensus. But let me, on this subject of Trump versus Trumpism, let me tell you one reason that even if I could be persuaded that Trumpism is good, and I do think certainly more attention should be paid to some issues that, as you say, both parties have neglected. But some of the things that just made him a total, non-starter for me are when he comes out, when he starts talking about Mexican immigration, and he says, they are rapists, they are this, they are that. And, of course, he throws in the qualifier, some of them are good people. Now, the problem I have with this is that, you don't have to be much of a student of world history to know that one of the most dangerous fault lines in any society is, an ethnic fault line. People, mass conflict can start, ethnic cleansing can happen, genocide can even happen, horrible things happen across this fault line. And we know that the reason is because, people, the kind of tribal part of their psychology can be readily aroused in some ways that render them irrational. And one of the best known ways of appealing to the irrational part of people, as opposed to just, you could just give them the economic analysis, as you might, about look, Mexican immigrants are competing with, for low-wage jobs. You could say that. But when you start saying they are rapists without actually providing any data, but when you say that, you're obviously appealing, you're intentionally not appealing to the rational part of people's brain. You're activating exactly the parts of the human mind that history shows us are dangerous things to activate. And so when Donald Trump says things like that, he's been ruled out for me. And my question to you was, did it bother you at all?
Was very, very far down the list of things that was concerned about in that election, frankly. One could go back and adjudicate everything he said, but I think maybe one point that I could make about his style, because this is something that a lot of the older people, the older Trump supporters who are trying to fashion him in the mold of the kind of conventional conservative, there's this temptation to separate the style from the substance, or the Trump from the Trumpism. I understand that temptation and would concede some value to it. But just because nobody really emphasizes the other position, I would say that there's some extent to which the style and substance cannot be separated in terms of him being successful. So much of the success behind Trumpism, or by Trump, was his mastery of a new style of communication. I would call it like a fourth generation style of communication. In fact, there's a great piece written for NATO by a fellow called Jeff Giesea on sort of mimetic warfare as a means of communication. That really, it's a kind of communication and style that was very much tailored toward our 2.0 environment, very much tailored toward the attenuated attention spans of people, suited to not the 24-hour news cycle, but like the 20-minute news cycle. And I think that really served as, for lack of a better term, I would call it an effective means of kind of asymmetrical psychological warfare that was effectively used, that really the dominant institutions of the West, every one of which was basically animated against his candidacy, was not really equipped to deal with at that point. And so I think there's a kind of genius in Trump's style, perhaps even more so than in the substance, that has maybe more obvious antecedents politically.
Well, some would say this style has antecedents politically, and they are not encouraging. I don't want to start talking about Germany in the 1930s, but appealing to people's, no, come on, I'm serious. Don't just roll your eyes. Appealing to people's ethnic prejudices is not a healthy thing. Reinforcing the false idea that some kind of large proportion of Mexican immigrants are racist, are rapists, is not a healthy thing, and it has a very inglorious past.
Yeah, I think these types of comparisons are. I suppose I can see where that's coming from, but I don't think it reflects any sense of the reality. Let me just make a sort of address a point there, and for someone whose chief concern is kind of the danger of a kind of ethno-nationalism being fomented by Trump's. Let me just suggest that for many of the people who are most freaked out by Trump don't understand things the way that I do, which is that in many ways you could interpret the implicit and in many cases explicit civic nationalism espoused by Trump as really the only meaningful and perhaps sustainable bulwark to the kind of ethno-nationalism that might serve as an alternative to this kind of globalist, kind of hyper-globalist expression. And because people don't interpret things in sort of this tripartite fashion, they're thinking nationalism is the same thing as ethno-nationalism, not realizing that a civic nationalist correction to some of the excesses of globalism could actually be the only remaining possible bulwark against the sort of ethnic and religious discord that might actually unfold if we allow the excesses of globalism to continue without qualification.
Well, yeah, but you could articulate, I assume you could articulate what you're calling a civic nationalism. I'm not totally sure what you mean, but I assume you could articulate it without appealing to people's ethnic prejudices. That's possible, well, sure. Right? You could do it.
I would think that this, generally speaking, this shouldn't be done. But I think that, again, the left's turn toward identity politics really, for just as a descriptive matter, almost makes this kind of necessary. I mean, we live in a situation where basically the kind of ethnic identity politics is not only allowed but encouraged in every group but the white working class. Is that an equilibrium? And I don't think it is. And so that's why I think it's so important to really address these things that need to be addressed in our politics in order to allow for things to equilibrate in the most civil fashion possible.
Okay, well, I guess, and this is related to this question of how you can, granted that you like Trumpism, how, why you support Trump, is kind of, to get back to an earlier question, why not look for salvation? I mean, I guess I'd like to hear you flesh out your ideology in a way that explains to me why you don't look for salvation on the left. And I guess the answer is you think identity politics are so entrenched on the left that it can't happen there. But I mean, I mean, in other words, why not, because some people are saying, look, let's find a Bernie Sanders who, to respond to one of your critiques of Sanders, is animated by foreign policy, for starters, and is more ardently and loudly supports a non-interventionist foreign policy, and, as Sanders has done in the past, suggests that some degree of moderation in the rate of, some clamping down on illegal immigration would be good for, wages and jobs for people in the United States. Why not look for salvation there? I guess you're saying, look, identity politics is too thoroughly ingrained in the Democratic Party.
I mean, if and when it comes, I'll be open to it. And I'm willing to, even though I don't agree with everything they say, I don't really agree with anybody on everything, but I have a certain admiration for figures like Glenn Greenwald, for figures like Julian Assange, for these people who, or even some of the spirit behind the Bernie phenomenon. Despite my criticisms, I'd say at least the Bernie people had they had real grievances. Their demands, I think, are a little bit half-baked, but the grievances behind that are real. And I think the left has potential for a kind of rethinking of things, which is precisely why I go back to this counterfactual. Hillary Clinton needed to lose in order to catalyze precisely the kind of rethinking that could lead to a kind of leftist that I might look for as a kind of political alternative. But that hasn't happened yet.
I'm not so sure the message hadn't been sent just by Trump's nomination. But leaving that aside, I mean, it's interesting that for you, what makes the left a nearly hopeless realm of salvation is the identity politics that you see as involving something of a counterpart to what I'm calling, Trump's appeal to bigotry, right? I mean, you're seeing identity politics as a kind of in some respects, a mirror image of what I'm complaining about in Trump, right? Because I'm saying Trump exacerbates ethnic fault lines. And you're saying identity politics does the same thing?
Yeah, I think that the way that our basic institutions are operating now needs to be fundamentally rethought. And again, I think there are figures who more or less identify with the left who are capable and willing to do that, as there are those who identify with right or conservatism, even some who might be considered establishment types. So I think these kinds of these classifications don't necessarily help in that regard. And the kind of paradigm that exists now is something that will require a certain degree of ingenuity that needs to take place outside the confines of these layers.
Okay. I still feel we haven't quite pinned you down ideologically. So here's a yes or no question. Do you favor significantly higher tax rates for the rich?
That is not a sufficiently specific question. I
mean, actually, it is. I mean, it's, you know what I mean. I mean, well, what more specificity would you like to be added? Like, I would like to see, higher tax rates. I would like to see a more progressive tax structure.
Yeah, I mean, so give you one example, is everybody complained about, Trump's flirting with the idea of a tariff. Now, maybe a tariff, maybe or maybe not, a tariff as opposed to the threat of a tariff, which could be effective, but the actual implementation of a tariff might not be the best way to achieve a certain economic or goal with respect to trade. Maybe cutting a corporate tax rate that will incentivize companies coming back to the country would be a better way to do that. In that case, I would support that. I would definitely support reconfiguring some of the tax laws in order to make it such that the ultra rich, the ultra powerful corporations are not allowed to sort of skimp on what they're doing. I'm very much amenable to talking about something like universal basic income. I think that's another thing that we didn't talk about, maybe because it's peripheral, but I think the challenge is coming forward with automation and so forth.
Okay, but what about, I mean, that's something that actually gets a certain kind of support on the libertarian right and right. Support on the left, and those right. are actually different versions of it, so that's not a very good way to figure out where I should place you on the map. So, but how about universal health care? How about what Bernie Sanders, leave aside whether it's single payer, but some system that just spends a lot of money ensuring that everyone has good health care. That might be a really beefed up form of Obamacare. It might be single payer. In either event, it's clearly something Trump's not going to give us. You can see that given what's going through Congress. So if you had to choose between what I just described and what seems to be working its way through Congress right now, which would you choose?
This is not an area that I'm a policy expert. As sort of a guiding principle, I think that we should have a system in which basically people don't get sick and die because they don't have enough money for health care. So that's basically my attitude on that. But I was interviewed once on the healthcare issue, and I'm not an expert on it. I looked into it, and it's an incredibly complex mechanism to really figure out just how to do that. I think there is something to this idea of allowing a competition across state lines, but the mechanisms for that, I can't really discuss that competently. I would only say that in a first world and serious country, nobody should be sick and die because they don't have money. I think there has to be something in place for pre-existing conditions. Trump also said something like this.
Well, yeah, but clearly the policy he's talking about wouldn't get it done because now, under the current policies he's supporting, some states could do radical cuts in Medicaid. Those are the poorest people who would be without support. So that's not something he actually supports in real life. It's something he claimed.
Well, look, I mean, it's a complicated situation. He has to deal with Congress, and so we shouldn't act like Trump, the guy who basically ran against every major institution, both public and private, once he gets in, he single-handedly has carte blanche and the ability to micromanage every single thing. He has a limited space of operation. And so to really put the healthcare troubles on his shoulders alone, I think is a little bit unfair.
Okay.
We'll see what we get.
Okay.
I mean,
Final sheerly ideological question, or attempt to kind of pigeonhole you. He talked a lot about infrastructure. What he seems to be supporting now are kind of tax incentives that would try to steer corporations to spend money on infrastructure, but that seems to favor certain kinds of things like toll roads and not other kinds of things like just improving bridges. Would you support a more straightforward approach in my mind, which is tax rich people, use the money to like repair bridges and rail lines and so on? It would put a lot of people to work, and it would involve taxing rich people. Do you support that?
I mean, I think that's a little bit. I mean, yeah, I would support something like that in principle. I don't think just the idea of taxing rich people necessarily is going to be the best way or even enough to finance something like this. I mean, if you look at something like,
affluent people.
Look at something like the Iraq War, with how much that costs. Imagine if that were used to develop infrastructure. I mean, I'm definitely in favor of prioritizing infrastructure in the United States domestically over the kind of trajectory that we've had from the Bush-Clinton policy.
But on military expenditure, Trump is moving in the other direction from the one it sounds like you would like. Not just with his Pentagon budget, but he's actively contemplating a ramp up in Afghanistan, and so on. So let me close with a question. It's not about ideology, but back to the Trump versus Trumpism question. The question of his sheer competence and whether that has become a source of concern to you. So, for example, we talked about healthcare, and you said, well, but he's got to deal with Congress. It's not easy. I grant you it's not easy, especially when you get elected, I guess, as a Republican, or maybe especially when there's Republican control of Congress. But in any event, during the healthcare thing, he is, from fairly reliable reports, I think you can infer that he evinced no actual comprehension of like what was going on, and no kind of even modestly deep grappling with the policy. He just kind of wanted to win, and so that seems to me like not a reassuring demonstration of competence. And then in a wholly another realm, just to take, it seems like there's something new every week, but just to take the last 10 days, okay? He goes to Europe. He's giving this NATO speech, and we now know apparently that his entire national security team, Secretary of Defense and State, and his national security advisor, had seen a copy of the speech where he was going to reaffirm Article 5, which means, yes, we are committed to the mutual support in the event of attack that is the essence of NATO. He took that out of his speech without even clearing it with his national security team. Leave aside the merits of that position. It's just like some people find that a troubling way for a president to proceed, where you go through the process of vetting a really important issue with all of the actual experts in your administration, and then at the last minute, without even telling them, say, just kidding. They have to read about it in the news that you were just kidding. And then more recently, this thing, so he goes to Saudi Arabia, and there's another issue. Partly, I think it's mainly a competence issue. He goes to Saudi Arabia. Oh, they give him a great show. They project images of him on a building. He loves them. And he basically signs on to their war against Iran in the Middle East, and which, again, is pretty plainly at variance with the kind of tune he was talking during the campaign. And then Saudi Arabia and these other Arab states almost not quite declare war on Qatar, but they do, impose a kind of isolation, even has aspects of a blockade. And this totally freaks out, again, Trump's national security team and virtually everyone in America who pays attention to these things, because for one thing, we have, important military headquarters and bases in cutter. And so, like, this is a problem. And Trump, characteristically, with his compulsion to spin everything as a personal victory, starts tweeting about, hey, this is like basically done with my support. His national security team is completely freaked out. And that just seems to me a manifestation of his temperament. I have to show them that since this happened, it's an affirmation of my greatness. I don't know how else to explain this, but the broad question I'm asking is, have there not been a whole series of issues during his administration that have given you serious doubts about the man's stability and competence?
Not really. I mean, somehow I remain...
I guess I have failed in my preamble. I invested a lot of time in that question, but I clearly did not achieve my objective.
I remain unmoved, especially when I consider the alternative, what the alternative would have been. I mean, so look, I'm not naive. I don't think everything's going perfectly, but this is a very messy circumstance. And someone like Trump won without really any kind of existing architecture in order to ideally support and implement something like Trumpism. And I mean, there's no like think tank that was there. There's really no source on which to draw that would...
Right, but I think there's a deeper problem here, which is that he doesn't know even what questions to ask. I mean, it gets back to the question of competence that people were raising before, which is the guy's never run an organization of any size. It's not like an actual CEO with administrative experience. And he showed no ability to actually build something from the ground up. His dad, gave him a $20 million loan that we know wasn't actually a loan. It was a gift. There was no risk to actually, defaulting on it. So, I mean, the guy he doesn't know how to go about figuring out how to start building an infrastructure, or even more immediately, how to go about setting up a system that informs him about things and helps him coherently decide what to do. He just clearly can't do that. Because, I mean, some people were reassured. He did hire some qualified people, in at least some realms, by conventional reckoning. But as I just said, then he just goes and ignores them without even telling them he's doing it. So you really think the guy has the intellectual wherewithal to do what needs to be done? And the temperamental wherewithal?
Yes to both, but I think that he's up against a lot of challenges. And so I try to be optimistic, but I think we'll just have to see how well he's able to navigate through those challenges in order to implement at least some of the basic and most important features of his policy. I think at this stage it's premature, and many of the same institutional organs that were actuated against him in the election remain antagonistic. And so I think I can understand these frustrations, but I think you have to understand that he is one person, and given the kind of change that is realistic to expect, I don't think that so far it's really fair to be too harsh on him in that respect. I mean, I'm willing to reserve my evaluation until at least he carries out a first term, because a lot of these problems are so entrenched. It takes some time.
Okay, well, I grant you he does face a lot of institutional opposition, some of which I think is unfortunate, even from my point of view. Okay, so we've gone a lot longer than we normally do, but I wanted to give you a chance to. I wanted to try to flesh out as thoroughly as possible your position. I'm sure we've failed to do that adequately from your point of view, and we should say that you've written some things that we can link to. We can link to the Duke piece. We can link to anything else you send to us. that you want linked to. And then there's a National Review Online piece about trade policy. Wait, I shouldn't do this, but I have one final question. My own preferred approach to dealing with some of your concerns about trade policy would be to have actual left-of-center trade agreements where you have actual meaningful labor and environmental accords. Mm-hmm. So you might get Mexico, in the extreme case, to agree to a minimum wage or something. Just quickly, is that kind of thing, could that meet some of your objections? Would you support that kind of stuff?
I would not support it on principle. I think the left should be thinking through some of these things, how to implement trade policy more favorable to the working class.
So you said you wouldn't not support it on principle. So you're not necessarily opposed.
Very open to
it. Okay. Glad to hear that. It's glad to end on a note of concord. Again, you've got the piece in National Review Online coming out on some of these economic issues. And thanks so much for your time. I really appreciate it. And maybe down the road we can check back in and see if either of us has changed our minds.
I'd love to, and thank you very much for the opportunity.
Okay.
I really appreciate it.
Well, thank you, Darren. Take care.
Thank you.